Today we will learn and reflect on the question, how could so many Christians either tolerate or support the totalitarian Nazi regime of Hitler? We can't help but ask this question today because we see the bulging eyes of the skeletal concentration camp victims looking up in those dreary black and white photographs. But we must realize that nobody in the pre-war years could have predicted the concentration camps that would come to define Nazism. In the pre-war years, many saw a reawakened national German pride and family values after the humiliation imposed by the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we use for this video and my blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. In the beginning of Hitler's term as Chancellor of Germany, before the Enabling Act was voted on that gave him dictatorial powers, Hitler posed as both anti-Semitic and as a friend of the German Catholic and Protestant churches. To understand why Hitler was seen as a friend of Christianity for a short time after he was elected, you need to understand the history behind the fascist movement of Mussolini, who was initially an inspiration for Hitler, and the history of the Russian Revolution. Now, because Mussolini was a hedonist and not a good Catholic, he was a friend of convenience to the Catholic Church in Italy. Mussolini's fascist government had pro-Catholic policies and helped pass much pro-Catholic legislation. And although he was granted dictatorial powers, Mussolini did not pass anti-Semitic legislation until the year preceding World War II. And our video on Fascist Italy includes the backstory of how the Church sought to survive in a modern, secular world by first negotiating a concordat with Napoleon, and over a century later with Mussolini when it signed the Lateran Accords of 1929, which created the Vatican City. However, the Catholic Church did not fare nearly so well when it negotiated a concordat with Hitler. Now, on the other hand, communism was the enemy of Christianity. The Bolsheviks in the decades after the Russian Revolution martyred tens of millions of Christians, who were mostly Orthodox Christians, and this outnumbered the cumulative number of martyrs in all countries and in all prior centuries. Hitler always painted Nazism as ideologically opposed to Bolshevism and the Jews, which were the same in his diluted ideology. Now, Germany on the eve of World War II was about 97% Christian. A third were Catholics, and two-thirds were Protestants. Therefore, the story of Christianity under Hitler is really two interlocking stories. First, there's the story of the German Catholic Church and its futile attempt to negotiate a concordat with the Nazis. And second is the story of the German Protestant Church. The Nazis tried to commandeer the Lutheran Church and turn it into a German Christian church that denied the Old Testament and the Jewishness of Jesus, glorifying the fatherland and the Nazi doctrines on race. Some churches formed the Confessing Church that resisted Nazi intrusions into church doctrines. About a sixth of German Protestant churches were confessing churches, another sixth were Nazi German Christian churches, and the rest of the churches tried not to be political, and they decided they wouldn't take either position. So we also want to ask, why did only a minority of the Protestant churches join the Confessing Church movement? And why did so many churches refuse to resist the attempts by Nazi ideologies to corrupt church doctrines and beliefs? To understand how Hitler was able to rise to power, we need to understand the pre-Nazi German history. Now, under the Peace of Augsburg, the treaty which ended the religious war following the Reformation, the prince of each German state determined the religion of that state. Now, during the 1870s, Bismarck unified the small German states under the Prussian throne, creating the modern German state, which was then governed under a constitutional monarch. Bismarck launched the Kulturkampf, or culture struggle, against the Catholic Church to limit the influence the Pope had over German affairs. All Prussian bishops and many priests were imprisoned or exiled. Catholics responded by organizing the Catholic Center Party. In time, Pope Pius IX died, and the more pragmatic Pope Leo XIII negotiated for Germany to repeal most of the anti-Catholic laws. And afterwards, the Center Party generally supported Bismarck's policy, although they were wary. The new German state paid the salaries of both pastors and priests, and later, Hitler's Nazi Germany would continue to pay the clerical salaries throughout the war. Like in the American Civil War not too long before, the casualties in World War I were staggering. The war in the Western Front was fought in muddy trenches that stretched from the ocean to the Alps. Tens and hundreds of thousands of soldiers would perish when they climbed out of the trenches to an eerie no-man's land full of muddy mortar craters littered with corpses and debris of war, anxious they would not fall victim to the mortars and machine guns of the enemy before they reached the enemy trenches. The privations of the war and the ultimate defeat of Germany in World War I discredited the monarchy, and the monarchy was overthrown and replaced by the Weimar Republic. Intense propaganda throughout the war led the German people to believe until the very end that victory was in sight. After all, the trenches were dug in French territory. All the battles were fought on French soil. No battles were fought on German soil. However, in reality, not only was victory not possible, but the Germans were short on food and ammunition and everything needed to wage war. But all Germans were shocked by the draconian terms of the Versailles Treaty ending World War I, and restrictions were placed on German industry and the military, and the German colonies were distributed among the Allies. And in addition, Germany had to pay heavy war reparations, and the Germans were forced to accept a humiliating war guilt clause. Hitler was not the only German, nor the first German, to label the Weimar politicians as traitors, to accuse the Weimar politicians of snatching away German victory and stabbing Germany in the back, allowing the Allies to declare victory. And as you can see in the cartoon, this was also interpreted as the Jews stabbing the Germans in the back. Shamefully, the German generals did not dare to contradict this conspiracy theory. Instead, they repeated the stab in the back lie loudly and constantly. The Weimar Republic could not easily repay these heavy reparations. In part because of these reparations, the Weimar German economy was in crisis in the early 20s, suffering from hunger, unemployment, and general dislocation. The German government responded by printing money, eventually causing hyperinflation, which wiped out German savings and pensions and salaries. Within months, a loaf of bread that previously cost a mark could cost 1 trillion marks. Prices rose during the day. Anytime you were paid, you ran to the store to spend the money. And the end of this time, during the time it took to drink a cup of coffee, the cost of that cup of coffee doubled. And then, in the 1930s, the Great Depression hit. And the Great Depression hit Germany in particular very hard, causing broad discontent that was fertile soil for the malignant Nazi ideology to take root and thrive. Mussolini had grabbed power in Italy after his fascist thugs marched on Rome in 1922. The next year, then obscure Adolf Hitler, inspired by Mussolini's example, tried to march on Munich with 2,000 Nazis, but due to poor planning and a strong police force, the march was broken up and Hitler was charged with treason. During his trial, a sympathetic judge allowed Hitler to deliver fiery speeches during his trial that were covered by the major newspapers, gaining notoriety for Hitler, broadening his base. In prison, Hitler wrote his Mein Kampf, where he laid out in surprising detail how he intended to seize power in Germany. After his release, Hitler changed tactics and sought to achieve power somewhat legally. And fascists were the enemies of the godless communists. All Europe was fearful that Lenin's Communist Party would succeed in igniting violent revolutions in Europe. This belief was partially justified by the events of the Spanish Civil War, which was fought from 1936 to the eve of World War II, 1939, and it degenerated into a bloody and brutal war between the Republican Communists and the nationalist fascists under General Franco. This was also a proxy war between Russia on one side and Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy on the other side. The Allies were neutral in the conflict. Although both sides were guilty of massacres, the Communists were the ones who brutally murdered thousands of priests, monks, and nuns. Also, the Nazis were able to test their new machines of war in actual combat. And now we'll discuss how Hitler rises to power. Although the Nazi Party was a small minority in the 1920s, after the coming of the Great Depression, the Nazis grew to become the largest party in Germany. All of the Nazis lost seats in the 1932 Reichstag election. The Conservatives formed a coalition government with the Nazis in January 1933. Hindenburg, the aging World War I general, would be president. Hitler would be appointed Chancellor, and Papen as Vice-Chancellor. Hindenburg and Papen thought they could control this corporal who had an 8th grade education, but Hitler quickly outwitted both of them. Hitler's first act as Chancellor was to ask Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag, to pave the way for the passage of the Enabling Act. And new elections were scheduled for March 5, 1933. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building caught fire, and a communist arsonist was arrested, tried, and executed. Now, today, historians debate whether this was a false flag operation, and it's hard to tell whether the fire was actually set by the Nazis and pinned on the communists. This was seen by many Germans as the beginning of a communist revolution in Germany, so the next day, at Hitler's urging, Hindenburg issued the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended most civil liberties in Germany, including habeas corpus, the right to a speedy trial, and the freedoms of press, expression, and public assembly. Even with the anti-red hysteria, the Nazis would only receive 37% in the Mark Reichstag election. To pass the Enabling Act, which would transform Hitler's government into a legal dictatorship, checked only by the authority of President Hindenburg, passing the Enabling Act would require a 2/3 majority vote. To reach this 2/3 threshold, Hitler would need the support of the Nazi, Conservative, and the Catholic Center parties. How did Hitler gain the support of the Catholic Center Party and alleviate the fears of Christians that the Nazi Party was essentially pagan and anti-Christian? Simple. Hitler lied. Hitler lied blatant lies. Hitler gave deceitful reassurances, and Hitler got religion for the day of the vote, March 23, 1933. So you might ask, how did so many Christians tolerate Nazism and anti-Semitism? And to answer that, let us listen to some post-war interviews of members of the Confessing Church as they struggle to answer this question. The son of a pastor explained why many Christians went along with the persecution of the Jews under Hitler. Just as the average Protestant was middle class and national, he was also anti-Semitic. Now today you can hardly speak of harmless anti-Semitism, but at the time we saw it as harmless. I was raised to believe that until the Jews rejected Jesus, they were a loyal people. The Jews were a wonderful people. The Jews were farmers and shepherds. And then God rejected the Jews. And since then the Jews have been merchants, good for nothing, and they infiltrate everything, everywhere they go. And against that you just had to defend yourself. And certain kinds of restrictions on the civil rights of Jews, that was generally talked about and sympathized with. One German said this: way of thinking was embedded in the Christian tradition in Germany. The persecutions were indeed hard on the Jews, and one had to pity the Jews, but they had brought it upon themselves somehow. Either because there had been Jews who had dominated the business sector, or because of their immoral business methods, or, and this was a reason of the pious, that it was the wrath of God which now, after such a long time, had turned upon the Jews. One German explained his experience as a Jewish Christian member of the Confessing Church. As a matter of principle, the German bourgeoisie, to which the overwhelming majority of pastors and parish members belonged, was anti-Semitic in the sense that Jews didn't belong to the church. The guilt of the Christians in the church rests in the fact that the commandment to love your neighbor was interpreted or taken to mean that one looked after your Christian brothers and sisters, those who had been baptized. Now that meant that when Christians came into conflict with the state or the police, the church or parish took care of them as long as the matter had to do with the church. But they didn't look after these people when it was political. The Christians in the church cared for Christians when something happened to them because they were Christians. But the responsibility for society, including the Jews, the Social Democrats, the Communists, the Gypsies, the Atheists, the responsibility for all these other people was not seen as a responsibility of the church. Now we'll get to passing the Enabling Act. Hitler reassured Christian believers in a speech to the Reichstag. The national government regards the two Christian confessions as the most important factor for the preservation of our national culture, and these rights will not be infringed. And Hitler also promised the Christian teachings would be welcome in the schools. And of course, the Reich regards Christianity as the unshakable foundation of our national life and morality. Hitler promised friendly relations with the Vatican Holy See, but about the only promise Hitler kept was that the state would continue paying clerical salaries during the duration of the Third Reich. Now, if anybody had any doubt that the Nazi regime was an evil regime, the Night of Long Knives soon proved this point. Vice-Chancellor Papen had managed to alienate the Catholic parties and also enable the rise of Hitler through his complex political maneuvering that eventually became his undoing. Papen and Hindenburg became concerned at the brutality and overreach of the Nazi government, and the army command was concerned by Hitler's huge SA brown shirt thugs that were causing terror in the streets of Germany. Papen delivered an address to the University of Marburg in June 1934. In his speech, Papen called for the restoration of some freedoms and advocated the end of SA terror in the streets. When he heard this, Hitler was furious. Hitler suppressed the publication of the Marburg Address. Papen then met with Hitler and threatened to resign unless the publication ban was lifted, threatening action by Hindenburg. Hitler outwitted Papen and Hindenburg, telling Papen that the ban of publication would be lifted at once and that the SA brown shirts would be suppressed if Papen would not resign and if they would both meet then with Hindenburg. 2 weeks later, Hitler kept his promise, and Papen and Hindenburg discovered that they could not manipulate and control Hitler. Now that Hitler was in power, the troublesome, thuggish SA brown shirt mobs needed to be reined in, and the ambitious head of the SA, the embarrassingly homosexual Ernest Röhm, was both a loose cannon and a threat to Hitler's power. During the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler directed his SS troops to purge the SA leadership. In addition to Röhm, between 100 and 1,000 of Hitler's enemies died during the purge, and this included several Nazis whose politics were suspect, and several Catholic politicians, and even some of Papen's associates were executed. Papen himself was placed under house arrest, and we found several photos from this period that appeared to document how Hitler and his thugs sought to drive Papen to the sidelines. After several weeks, Papen resigned as vice-chancellor and served out the war as ambassador to Austria and then Turkey. After the purge, the SA brown shirt forces were downsized, while the paramilitary SS forces gained in strength. Both the SS and the SA forces terrorized the Jews. Soon after, in August 1934, Hindenburg died of lung cancer. He was 86 years old. Quickly, a law was passed that declared the office of president vacant. Hitler was now both chancellor and Führer. His hold on power was now absolute. Amazingly, amongst all of these struggles, the Catholics still are negotiating their concordat with the Nazis. There was no one German archbishop heading the German Catholic Church, and the exact policies on relations with the state varied from bishop to bishop. Prior to the Enabling Act, Catholics in many bishoprics were forbidden from joining the Nazi Party. Nazis were not welcome to attend funerals or other group functions in their Nazi regalia with Nazi banners. And any Catholics who were known Nazi sympathizers were forbidden from receiving the sacraments. Since the Catholics in their center party acquiesced in the passage of the Enabling Act, these restrictions were relaxed, and Catholics could now support the Nazis and join the Nazi Party, and some did just that. Although there were definitely anti-Christian elements in the Nazi program, many Catholics were reassured by the Nazi assertion of the values of religion, of course as Nazis defined it, and love of the fatherland, and the Nazis' strong opposition to the godless Bolshevism. Why shouldn't Hitler be trusted? After all, in Mein Kampf, Hitler said he wasn't interested in interfering with German religious institutions. Now, previously, the Pope had negotiated a concordat with Fascist Italy with generally positive results. Soon after the passage of the Enabling Act, Papen had initiated negotiations for a German concordat with the Vatican. There were many parallels between the two concordats. Neither Mussolini nor Hitler were religious men. Both were dictators of totalitarian police states with personality cults. Both sought total control over their citizens. Both sought to control the church. And both fascist regimes employed thugs who harassed and persecuted Christians. And both concordats were negotiated during times when both regimes openly committed murder to consolidate their power. In both instances, the Pope, being suspicious of democracy, betrayed the Catholic political parties who supported the Church. Instead, the Pope chose to support the fascist parties as likely political victors. But as Mussolini generally kept his word and became a real partner with the Catholic Church up until the start of the war, Hitler, on the other hand, broke the terms of his concordat before the ink had dried. Hitler was more interested in how the news of the concordat would be received diplomatically and in the newspapers than he was in the actual terms of the concordat. Although there were intense negotiations, in the end the exact terms meant nothing to Hitler, since he intended to break those terms immediately with impunity anyway. However, Hitler always expected the Catholic Church to conform to their part of the treaty. What were the terms of the treaty? Catholics were free to profess their faith and run their churches independently within the limits of the law, which is an unfortunate Nazi loophole. Bishops appointed by the Pope would need to be approved by the state, which was a standard clause in concordats over the centuries, but also the bishops were required to take an oath of loyalty to the state. Now that's new. The Catholic Church was guaranteed control over church schools, seminaries, and Catholic teachers. Although the Church won the right to offer pastoral care in hospitals and prisons, this was soon violated when the Church was forbidden to hold services in concentration camps. Already stories were circulating about the brutal conditions in these camps. And Hitler got his wish in a clause that forbade priests from participating in politics. The Concordat was finally approved in September 1934. The Concordat was a political victory for Hitler. The Catholic Church had now put their stamp of approval on the Nazi regime. Now maybe the Catholic Church was more likely to survive having negotiated the Concordat, but the Church sold its soul and made resistance to the regime more problematic for Catholics. The consent to liquidate all Catholic organizations with a political program helped strengthen the Nazi regime. But both the German and Italian concordats survived the end of the war, and they are still in effect today. Just like in Fascist Italy, after the Concordat was signed, the church bells rung for special Thanksgiving masses celebrating the signing of the Concordat. Just like in Fascist Italy, formations of SA and SS Nazi thugs with swastikas and banners marched into the churches alongside Catholic bishops and diplomats. And just like in Fascist Italy, members of the Catholic organizations rushed to affirm their loyalties to the Nazi Party and the Nazi state. And now we'll discuss the parallel story of the struggle between the Protestant positive Nazi Christianity versus the Christianity of the confessing churches. Hitler, in the 1920 Nazi Party platform, supported the notion of positive Christianity, which sought to fuse Christianity with Nazi racial ideology. This was a Christianity without an Old Testament, an Aryan Christ who was not a Jew, an absorbing Nazi Christianity that sought to absorb all other Christian churches, and a Nazi church that would glorify the fatherland. These Nazi-leaning churches were known as German Christians, and they managed to gain control of the minority of the Protestant German evangelical churches. Hitler proposed to combine these German Protestant churches into one big Reich Church. When a moderate was elected as the Protestant German evangelical bishop, Hitler, the Nazi Party and press, and the SA and SS, and the Gestapo joined together to coerce the election of a Nazi bishop, Ludwig Müller, who was both an early member of the Nazi Party and politically inept. These machinations caused many member churches to distance themselves from the national organization. Many churches were offended by the heavy-handed Nazi attempt to hijack the churches, and by Bishop Muller's crude attempts to grab power from his fellow bishops. The Confessing Church movement was formed to resist this pressure to Nazify the German Protestant churches. The leading theologian of this movement was Karl Barth, who was then theology professor at Bonn. During a synod in 1934, Barth was the primary author of the Barmen Declaration, which was the main confession of the Confessing Church. Barth was a hero to his followers. One of his students said, "If it hadn't been for Barth, Hitler would have had no trouble with the church." Barth theologically prepared a church to ask if it really had a common confession, and the word confession caught fire. Barth helped Protestants rediscover the concept of true heresy. One of his students remembered that as the war progressed, Karl Barth had progressed further theologically. His basis for his demands that we help the Jews was that they are the people of God. That was a new basis for understanding the Bible, Judaism, and with that for understanding anti-Semitism as well. The view that anti-Semitism was merely the antipathy of a majority against a minority had to be abolished. Persecution of the Jews had led to the persecution of the Gypsies. Karl Barth asked, how do we unlearn the anti-Semitism in the Christian tradition? Now, the Confessing Church was not monolithic. Confessing churches did not leave their denomination. They were really a church within a church. Some confessing church pastors refused to make any compromises, and chief among them was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who eventually was involved in the plot near the end of the war to assassinate Hitler and would die in a Gestapo prison near the end of the war. Bonhoeffer was also adamant that Christians should concern themselves with the fate of all Jews, not just the Jews that converted. The Barmen Declaration declared that Jesus is the sole authority of the church, not the Führer, that the Word of God is the source of revelation, not Nazi ideology, and that the message and order of the church should not be influenced by Nazi politics. German Christians had the freedom to disobey Nazi dictates when they conflicted with scriptural mandates. The Confessing Church had no place for Nazi Aryan ideals. The Nazi German Christians were worshiping a different God. The Barmen Declaration repeated Barth's claim that Christ, as recounted by the Bible, was the only authority over the church and its only source of revelation. Two participants in the conference remember. People later became agitated over what was not said at Barmen, and of course it's true. In Barmen, Nazism was not directly addressed. Anti-Semitism wasn't directly addressed, nor militarism, or the authoritarian system as such. And now indirectly, Barmen has some of that. But Barmen, above all, was a rediscovery of the identity of the church within a divided church. Basically, we were not a church. We were a collection of different confessions within a church, awash in generalities. And he's referring to the German evangelical church being a union of the Reformed and Lutheran and other Protestant churches. The merging of Christian and national identity was almost complete in a large sector of German Protestantism. We hope to bring our brethren away from that so they could recognize the contradictions of being both a Christian and a Nazi, and perhaps bring them away from this Prussian nationalism. Now, the next year Barth was deported to Switzerland when he courageously refused to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. Although the Confessing Church resisted Nazi encroachments into the church, it did not encourage political opposition to the Nazis. Indeed, some of the confessing pastors were card-carrying Nazi Party members, which sometimes caused the Gestapo to be more lenient when they harassed them. Despite this harassment from the Gestapo and the Nazi regime, the Confessing Church grew to over 5,000 churches, while the German Christian Reich Church stagnated. Sometimes there were show trials, but once, when several Protestant bishops were arrested, the protests both home and abroad, including a march of thousands of parishioners singing Luther's Mighty Fortress is Our God, embarrassed the regime. Some bishops appealed and met with Hitler, who washed his hands of the inept Bishop Muller. Although he would remain as Catholic bishop, the Nazis lost interest in their German Christian project. The Confessing Church would be persecuted increasingly through the end of the war, and many confessing pastors served time and often died in Gestapo prisons or the concentration camps in Germany. Many Confessing Church students were purposely drafted into the military service. Many confessing Christians wrestled with the question of whether they should have done more during the war to oppose the Nazis. But many who actually did died in concentration camps or on the battlefield. Although the individual churches initially sought mainly the freedom to worship and congregate without governmental interference, they were increasingly forced to face the many moral challenges thrust upon them. Now, the Nazis actually backed down when the churches protested the Nazi sterilization and euthanasia policies. Nazi ideology had always championed an extreme form of social Darwinism to achieve the pure and healthy Aryan race, partly by denying life to those whom the Nazis considered unworthy of life. At the 1929 Nazi Party gathering in Nuremberg, Hitler praised the Spartan ideal of infanticide, where the community leaders, rather than the parents, selected those infants who were sufficiently virile to benefit the state, and exposing the least viable infants to wild animals. Hitler proclaimed, if Germans every year would give birth to 1 million children and eliminate 800,000 of the weakest, this would strengthen our nation. How chilling! The final solution of the Holocaust may not have gone as far as Hitler had wanted to go. Soon after the Nazis grabbed power, they tried to implement first voluntary and later compulsory sterilization for certain disabled and institutionalized patients. The Nazis encountered public resistance from several Catholic bishops, as sterilization is specifically forbidden by church teaching, and doctors would decline to perform sterilizations on grounds of conscience. The Nazis encountered stiffer resistance from both Catholics and Protestants against their euthanasia initiatives. In September 1939, which, as you remember, the war had already broken out, Hitler issued an order to euthanize all patients with incurable diseases to eliminate useless eaters. The disabled and retarded patients were also targeted. At first the victims were shot, but as the program expanded, the Nazis experimented with gassing patients in rooms disguised as showers. Now, those who lived near these institutions noticed buses arriving with patients and always leaving empty, and chimneys constantly belching smoke. The euthanasia program soon became an open secret because too many were involved in its administration to keep it a secret. Many of these institutions were run by the churches. However, many administrators refused to answer questionnaires inquiring about the status of their institutionalized patients. Sometimes the government had to send in their own doctors to fill out the forms to expedite these killings. Doctors argued to get people off the lists, sometimes sending the patients home to avoid execution. In addition, doctors and midwives were requested to fill out questionnaires on infants born with birth defects. And this is one of the more haunting posters of the Nazi period, and it says, this person suffering from hereditary defects costs the community 60,000 Reichsmark during his lifetime. Fellow Germans, this is your money too. In 1940, after the war started, a Protestant minister spoke out publicly to his congregation, telling them how we receive the urns from the murder institutions with a letter of lies. So-and-so died of this and that illness, and the body was cremated immediately due to danger of an epidemic. We cannot stand at the graves and say, after it has pleased Almighty God to call our sisters from this life, when we knew she'd been murdered. We have to stand in front of our patients and say publicly, as the church, this is murder. Murder goes against God's commandments, and murder goes against God's will. Now, we can lobby the government quietly for more humane policies for only so long. But there is a limit when silence has to end, when we can no longer remain silent about these dreadful crimes, because otherwise we make ourselves guilty of these crimes. Sometime after the practice had been revealed to the public, the Catholic Bishop von Galen bravely condemned the practice from his pulpit. Do you or I only have the right to live only as long as we are productive? If not, then someone only has to order a secret decree that the measures tried out on the mentally ill be extended to other non-productive people, maybe like those who are incurably ill with lung disease, or those who have been disabled on the job, or even maybe severely wounded soldiers. Then there will not be a one of us who is sure any more of the sanctity of his own life. Woe to humanity, woe to our German people, when the sacred commandment, thou shalt not kill, is not only violated, but when this violation is tolerated and carried out without punishment. And he could have added, without permission. Many were horrified by these killings. Sometimes pastors and bishops publicly criticized the killings, and more often they appealed directly to high Nazi officials. For once the Nazis backed down. Less than a month later, Hitler signed an order ending the euthanasia program that had killed over 70,000 patients. But the euthanasia program did not finally end until the war ended. It was simply carried out on a quieter and smaller scale. Hitler's rants in his Mein Kampf reveal that the elevation of the Aryan race was central to the Nazi ideology, that the Jews did not deserve to be citizens, the Jews did not deserve their jobs, the Jews did not deserve their possessions, the Jews did not deserve their family, Jews only deserve persecution and misery. Jews would either be driven to exile or executed. Who was Jewish? That did not depend on your faith. That depended on your blood. You were Jewish if you had 3 Jewish grandparents, or 2 Jewish grandparents if you were married to a Jew. First, Jewish shops were boycotted. Then Jews were fired from their jobs as teachers and civil servants. And then Jews were banned from the professions, and this included pastors. The race laws had another immediate effect on the churches. Everyone was desperate to prove to the government that they had no Jewish blood. The proof was often in the baptismal registries, so churches had to hire full-time secretaries to process the proof of ancestry paperwork for their parishioners. The first protests for both the Catholic and Protestants were made on behalf of those few of their clergy and parishioners who had converted from Judaism. But even in the confessing churches, many acquiesced to Nazi pressure. There were many Christians who would protest the injustices against converted Jews, but they never protested persecutions against practicing Jews. However, some pastors like Dietrich Bonhoeffer wanted to oppose the persecution of all Jews and all others persecuted under the Nazi race laws, since all Christians were bound to love their neighbor as themselves. That is the core principle of Christianity. Now, Karl Barth agreed, but encouraged Bonhoeffer to be patient for the moment. These horrifying events had greatly concerned Pope Pius XI, and so he issued the Palm Sunday address. The Catholic Church may have experienced even greater persecution than the Protestant and Confessing Churches, in part because it was more centralized and thus an easier target. Great pressure was placed on the Catholic youth and student organizations. Finally, they were disbanded and merged into the Nazi youth organizations. Likewise, great pressure was placed on the Catholic press, and even when they published pieces praising the regime, these praises were never sufficiently subservient, and the Catholic press was eventually shut down. And the Pope was receiving ever more worrying reports about the abysmal conditions in the concentration camps, and with the ever-increasing death tolls. More and more Catholic priests were forced to serve time in the camps, alongside many confessing church pastors. Pope Pius XI was aging and worried about his eternal salvation. He knew that if he spoke out forcefully, that the persecution of the church would increase. But enough was enough. 300,000 copies of his papal encyclical, With Burning Concern, were successfully secretly smuggled into Germany and read from every Catholic pulpit on Palm Sunday. Hitler was not directly named, but rather referred to as the mad prophet oppressing the church and breaking the terms of the Concordat. The encyclical proclaimed the true belief in God could not be reconciled with the idolatrous deification of a race, people, or state, that the God of Christianity could not be imprisoned in a single race. He opposed the Nazi principle that right is what is advantageous to the people, proclaiming that what is morally illicit can never be truly advantageous, and Christians have no right to obey laws that are contrary to natural moral laws. The faithful were bound to believe in Christ, divine revelation, and the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, and challenged the totalitarian claims of the Nazi regime. The encyclical proclaimed the humility in the spirit of the gospel and prayer for the assistance of grace are perfectly compatible with self-confidence and heroism, and that the priest's first loving gift to his neighbors is to serve truth and refute error in any of its forms, and both of these proclamations are anathema to Nazi sensibilities of superiority. Hitler was furious. The Gestapo seized many of the copies of the encyclical. A dozen print shops were seized, and hundreds of Catholics were thrown in prison and in concentration camps. The Nazis trumped up immorality trials against priests, monks, and nuns, and confiscated church assets. But the encyclical did not totally condemn totalitarianism. Succumbing to the relentless anti-Catholic Nazi propaganda, many Catholics left the church. Hitler did not want to overreact. He wanted the allegiance of the Catholics. But Hitler planned further retributions against Catholics and the Pope and all Christians after the war. Now, there was a rare incident where Hitler was forced to back down on his extreme persecution of the Jews. The Nuremberg race laws had forbidden new marriages between Jews and Aryans, but existing marriages were not annulled. Hitler decided to close this loophole and in early 1943 ordered that all such existing marriages be annulled and the Jewish husbands be arrested. And in Berlin alone, 6,000 Jews were arrested and on their way to the death camps. Surprisingly, their Aryan wives followed them to their temporary detention and spent hours screaming and howling for their husbands. The Gestapo just did not want their secrecy over this operation blown, so they released their non-Aryan husbands, and Catholic bishops agitated for the husbands that had been deported to be returned. For once, outraged virtue stared down the evil Nazi regime. And then we have the night of horror, the night of the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And if anyone had doubts about the cruel, evil nature of the Nazis, these doubts were shattered by the events of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, on November 9th and 10th, 1938. Throughout Germany, the SS and SA stormtrooper thugs smashed the windows and vandalized Jewish stores, homes, hospitals, and synagogues, and they were burned, looted, and demolished by sledgehammers. Prayer books, Torah scrolls, artworks, and philosophical texts were burned. Many ordinary Germans gleefully joined in the mob violence. Many Jews were murdered, and many more committed suicide. The Nazis had to pin blame for these rampages on the Jews themselves, so they waited for an incident, the assassination of a German diplomat by a Polish Jew boy in Paris. Since it was deemed their fault, the Jewish community was fined 1 billion Reichsmarks. Over 20,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps, and some were released when they promised to emigrate for the price of all their property. Jews were no longer welcome in Germany. Many Jews tried to immigrate, but the United States and other countries had restrictive immigration laws and rejected the Jews. Many of the Jews had to return to the continent and their eventual deaths. Some Christians privately tried to help the Jews financially and in other ways. Some confessing pastors actively helped many Jews to immigrate, even obtaining false passports and hiding Jews. Jews in Germany feared for their lives. Now, why didn't more Germans speak out during the Kristallnacht? One newlywed admitted, "I frankly admit to you that sometimes you had to push yourself not to be a coward. I had just married in 1936, and I had to weigh every word I spoke on a scale. When you have a child, then you're not as courageous as the Catholic priests are with their light baggage." One confessing German Christian remembers the large number of suicides among the Jews in Berlin. Jews had to wait a week and a half for a funeral due to the overload caused by 20 to 30 Jewish suicides a day, of which the German people, because of the isolation of the Jews, learned nothing. And the clouds of war gathered. Hitler was cheated out of his war in Munich in September 1938. The English Prime Minister Chamberlain appeased Hitler and proclaimed peace for our time by allowing Hitler to swallow the German-speaking Sudetenland. And soon Hitler broke even this agreement by swallowing all of Czechoslovakia. During a break in negotiations, Chamberlain was having a chat with Hitler. Chamberlain was discussing England's problem with Gandhi, the Indian leader. Hitler's advice to Chamberlain? Simple. shoot Gandhi. And here's a picture of Chamberlain arriving with that memorable speech. My good friends, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Less than a year later, Hitler and Stalin invaded Poland, starting World War II in Europe. Hitler planned to exterminate all the Polish Jews and the Polish intelligentsia, including over 1,000 Polish Catholic priests, and enslaving the rest of the Slavic peoples. Soldiers on the Eastern Front were telling horrible stories how Russian Jewish men, women, and children were lined up and machine-gunned by the thousands. Gas chamber showers in the Polish death camps suffocated more than 100,000 German Jews by the end of 1942. Catholic bishops were kept informed of these killings by friendly German intelligence officers. Most of the German concentration camps were labor camps with massive mortality rates, while the massive concentration camps in Poland were mostly extermination camps. While German Jews were shipped to the eastern camps in Poland, over 7 million Polish and Russian slave laborers were shipped west to Germany, where they made up 20% of the workforce. The size of the camps grew as the war progressed. In 1939, there were 6 major concentration camps, including Dachau, with about 20,000 total inmates. By 1944, there were 20 major concentration camps, many of them death camps, 165 work camps, and over 1,000 feeder and subsidiary camps holding millions of inmates. And in 1944, 90% of the inmates of the work camps were non-Germans, and many women and children were slave laborers. Now, unfortunately, in their invasion of France, the Nazis gained a tremendous tactical advantage by driving their tanks through what the Allies thought was the impenetrable Ardennes forest, bypassing the heavily defended Maginot Line. And in 2 weeks, the German tanks and troops also reached Paris, objectives that had never been reached in the many bloody years of World War I. This swift victory caused great patriotic pride and fervor in Germany, making it more difficult for the Church to oppose the totalitarian policies of the Nazi police state. You never saw an organized resistance in Nazi Germany that you saw in Vichy and occupied France. But then Germany was the conquerors rather than the conquered. There were many individual cases of resistance. For example, a priest in Berlin offered up prayers for Jews in his daily masses, but this priest died in the Dachau camp. There were many other Catholic priests who were either executed or died in concentration camps for both moral stances and for trivial offenses. Although the Confessing Church was never a resistance organization, some individuals were part of a small German resistance, including the martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Well, so what could the ordinary devout do in such extraordinarily evil times? Should they try to comfort their Jewish neighbors who'd been ordered to the train station to be sent to the death camps? Did they help the Jews flee from deep inside Germany? Did they accompany them to their train station? What could they do? One confessing Christian who was haunted by these choices remembers, "We were never sure whether we were doing the right thing or not. We'd been brought up differently, and it was war, and then it's hard to undertake something against your own country. Later, when young people asked us, particularly young people from abroad, why we hadn't resisted more, I tried to explain to them how hard it is, particularly during a war, to do something illegal that could lead to punishment." And our confessing Christian continues, "We were simply too cowardly. That's what I would say today. That is the great guilt we have taken upon ourselves. It was due to the war. We were against the government, but our men were on the front. My 2 brothers were also soldiers." Many do not realize that thousands of concentration labor camps were built in Germany and across the Third Reich. One pastor in Germany remembers, "The concentration camp lay between my 2 parishes. The borders of the camp were a few hundred meters from my parsonage. From the fields behind my house, you saw the towers and boundary walls of the camp. When the prisoners were taken to their workplace, we saw them emaciated and wraith-like. Parish members and school children often put bread unobtrusively on this curb, out of pity, so that the prisoners could grab it and get a little more nourishment. And this happened even during the war when food was rationed." Our pastor continues, There were no gas chambers in the camp near us, but they had a crematorium. When the prisoners died as a result of the treatment of the camp, or they died from not enough food, overwork, and the gruesome treatment, they were cremated. We could see the number of murdered prisons in the perpetually smoking chimneys of the crematorium. Some were murdered when, out of desperation, they ran into the barbed wire of the camp. Those of us who lived in the south part of the parish witnessed the Russian POWs arriving, totally exhausted. They had been transported for weeks, standing in closely penned in cattle cars, and when they pulled up to the train station, they just fell out. This always took place at night under the glare of spotlights. A tower of corpses rose beside the still living bodies that tumbled out onto the platform. The living prisoners would be driven by the SS men with whips and dogs into the camp, and those who collapsed got a kick that snapped their necks. Our parishes knew what was happening there. The knowledge of the procedures in the camp lay like a poison cloud over our parishes. Because of that, the recognition grew quickly that this war would work its way out on us like the judgment of God. There were many labor camps where conditions were harsh, but they were not as harsh as concentration camps. One half-Aryan worker remembers, "We were housed in military barracks where 24 people slept instead of 16. The room was overfilled, but we did have an oven in the room. We had as much wood as we could take from the forest to heat the oven, and we received our board, and we even had the chance to steal sugar beets or potatoes from the fields whenever we wanted, so we had enough to eat." Although this camp was under the control of the Gestapo, we had a camp commandant who screamed like a starling, but they didn't touch anyone physically here. And under the most threadbare pretenses, this commandant gave individuals weekend leaves. I have once had such a leave myself. From the account, it seems that they were paid very little, if anything, for their labor, but there was no labor unrest there. They weren't starved or beaten or overworked. Life was good as life could be for a slave in Nazi Germany. Perhaps many French POWs worked in camps like this camp. Many criticized Pope Pius XII, who was more diplomatic than his predecessor, for his failure to protest publicly against Nazi atrocities. Now, during his 1942 Christmas radio address, he called for more humane conduct of the war, but he never directly criticized Hitler. The Pope's fear was that the abandonment of papal neutrality by directly criticizing Nazi brutality in the middle of a bloody war could only worsen the conditions of Catholics in Nazi-occupied countries. After Italy was taken out of the war, the Nazis began rounding up the 8,000 Jews of Rome. About 7,000 Jews were able to avoid this roundup by going into hiding. Many hid in the monasteries and convents and other buildings of the Vatican. In his book, Gunter Louis further discusses the question of whether more could have been done by the Catholic Church. But we must keep in mind that the Nazi army largely left alone the Catholic city and the Catholic institutions during the occupation and retreat from Rome. What would the occupying Nazi forces have done had Pope Pius XII openly antagonized the ever more desperate Nazis? Pope Pius XII survived the war with his reputation intact. There are many who today argue he could have done far more to protect the Jews from the Holocaust. But if he had been more vocal, perhaps fascist and Nazi troops would have marched in and murdered everyone in the Vatican. Hitler, after all, had been planning to murder the Pope once he won the war in Europe. Now, his successor, Pope John XXIII, opened the windows of the Catholic Church to the modern world by calling the Second Vatican Council. The experiences of the Catholic Church in Italy, Germany, and France influenced the decrees of the Council, and Vatican II, in its decree on religious freedom, extolled the virtues of democracy. After the Church's experience under the fascist Mussolini and the Nazi Hitler, the Catholic Church no longer trusted totalitarian regimes, even when they seemed to be friends of the Church. The war brought out the worst in the morally weak. One prison chaplain was discussing his war experiences with a farmer, and he remembered, "I had SS men in my prison who loaded Jewish children onto a bus, and they said they were taking them on an outing, and instead they hanged them in the forest." And the farmer said, oh, what criminals they were. But the chaplain responded, "They were just farm boys from Schleswig-Holstein. Before that, they wouldn't have bent a hair on a dog or a horse or any other animal. But they hung children." Now, the government tried to keep news of these mass murders from the ordinary people. One lady could not recall when she first heard of the mass murders. We knew some things, but we never knew the entirety. We knew more than others, but we actually learned the extent of the horrors after 1945. No one ever came back from the concentration camps, and when people did return, they had to sign that they would not talk, and they were much too afraid to talk. The war softened the hearts of many Germans. One German remembers shopping during the brutal Allied bombing of Berlin, and the shopkeeper was talking to another customer whom she knew and said, "This is our punishment for what we've done to the Jews." And she dared to say that much, although I was a stranger in her shop. And now we'll talk about the sources we used for this video. My only complaint with the books that I used for this video is they were written so soon after the war that they assume the reader already has a basic knowledge of the events that had been so recently covered in the newspapers. One especially treasured source is Victoria Barnett's book, For the Soul of the People. This book tells the story of the Confessing Church, and she used as a primary source about 60 interviews with confessing Protestants who survived the war. There were also interviews with them on what it was like to be drafted and serve on the Eastern Fronts, and many other interviews, and this is a fascinating book to read and a real treasure of memories. Another valuable source is Gunter Louis' book on the Catholic Church in Nazi Germany, and this also has many stories of individuals who resisted the increasing Nazification of Germany and the Church. A distant third is The Complicity in the Holocaust, and we also include the book that we used as the main source for our video on Fascist Italy, The Pope and Mussolini, because it so excellently depicts how closely intertwined the fascist Italian regime under Mussolini was with the Catholic Church under first Pope Pius XI and then Pope Pius XII, and how the Catholic Church first thrived, then regretted becoming partners with a regime that turned evil, following the lead of Hitler passing the Italian race laws in 1938, and he also has many details of the negotiation of the Reich Concordat with Germany, and we have the slender book on Hitler's American model, which shows how the Nazi lawyers used the precedent of America's Jim Crow racial segregation laws as precedent when drafting the Nazi Nuremberg race laws that initiated the persecution of the Jews. And we have a video specifically discussing this horrifying connection. And we have other videos on anti-Semitism and racism in the war years and the post-war years. Viktor Frankl's message in his book, A Man's Search for Meaning, is that no matter what challenges life throws at you, even the challenges of the Nazi concentration work camps, you can find the strength to persevere if your life has meaning. Also, the stoicism of Nelson Mandela of South Africa, who went from prison to the presidency and who was imprisoned for challenging apartheid, shows how we can persevere and defeat racial hatred in our lives and society. And finally, the spiritual danger of white evangelical Christian nationalism is that it can too easily morph into white supremacy. And we challenge our listeners to sample our videos on civil rights so you can be more compassionate toward the plight of our black brothers in Christ. Frederick Douglass belongs to the first generation of black leaders. He escaped from slavery and became a leading abolitionist orator before the Civil War, and was a leading civil rights leader during the Reconstruction years after the Civil War. Booker T. Washington was a teenager when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the Deep South, and he was both an orator and a second-generation black leader who focused on educating the freed slaves so they could improve themselves. W.E.B. Du Bois was born during Reconstruction and was an orator, writer, and a third-generation activist black leader who helped found the NAACP. And Father Tolton, like Booker T. Washington, was emancipated during the Civil War. He was invited to study in Rome for the priesthood and was the first former slave who was ordained a priest, and this was a tremendous achievement because when he was emancipated, he was totally illiterate. The YouTube description links to the video script in our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos and other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.